This is for Jenny. It says, David says, in 1929 to 1934, Stalin starved 4 million Ukrainians in the cause of collectivization. In the same period, Stalin eliminated by forced immigration the entire Tatar population of Crimea. Did consumers in the Leningrad-based camera industry include journalists in Poland and Ukraine? Ms. Goetz's research may be of great interest to Yale history professor Timothy Snyder, whose undergrad course on the history of Ukraine is available in its entirety on YouTube. Any comment on that?
Sure. I do not believe that any journalists that were working in Poland and Ukraine at the time were necessarily using these cameras. That said, Anne Applebaum has done work that shows the ways in which any evidence of the famine and the violence of collectivization was completely eliminated from visual record. So even if there were journalists that were taking photos, the Stalin government was very exacting about making sure that they were eliminated and destroyed. I think it's an Applebaum also, and the Memorial Project in Moscow that has made some effort to collect any visual remnants, but they're very spare. Most, I think, especially in the period that you're talking about, most professional photographers, if they were working for Pravda or a very high-end newspaper, they likely had a Leica. And maybe would have a photocore or a Fed later in the 1930s. But they were not usually sent to places that positive construction of the Soviet Union was not happening in.
I'll chime in, but I probably shouldn't because I don't know enough about this example to flesh it out in great detail. But I have been meaning to investigate a photographer called Gareth Evans, is it? A Welshman who photographed in Ukraine in that period. I know there was a film made of his experiences recently. I haven't seen it, but there have also been efforts to memorialize his work here in Wales. I think in the film he was shown as using a Leica, but I'd be surprised if that was the case. I'm not sure there'd be many Leica users in Wales in the period, but I might be wrong. But that's prompted me to investigate that a bit further and find out when he was there, why he was there, and what he was using.
Yes, most remaining visual documentation of the famine in the late 1920s, early 1930s, I believe comes from foreign correspondence. And maybe he picked up the Leica on his way. You know, maybe he passed through Germany. I don't, anything's possible.
All right, Michael had a question front here.
Hi, Tom. That was a really, really rich paper, so thank you for providing that today. I just wondered if you think the model that you've outlined for Nikon is applicable with other camera marks, and particularly thinking about Leica, because what's interesting is that a lot of those pictures of photographers, they often had a Leica around their neck as well. And I just jotted down a few points that when you were talking about whether it was the availability through the PX stores, the lenses, or whether it's a more technical requirement around the SLR versus the rangefinder of the Leica that gave Nikon that impetus during the Vietnam War, at a point when Leica had traditionally been the photojournalist camera really since the sort of 1930s. Just if wondered if you've got any sort of view on that, and whether your model perhaps is applicable to other marks.
In a sense, what I've done was a bit selective in that, I wanted to look at that camera, and so I followed that thread. But when you read the memoirs and the accounts and the essays of photographers, they're often talking about both cameras and how they would use them for different for different purposes or at different points in the conflict. So Tim Page talks about the sort of availability of the Nikon, but also the kind of ruggedness of the Leica and the cameras that Jones Griffiths used obviously were not limited to the Nikon. So I think absolutely it's a story to be investigated. I'm sure there's lots of elements of that research that have already been done. It would be a longer cultural history, obviously, given the sort of timescales we're talking. And I think it would be fascinating to look at it in terms of the interactivity of the two. So, the Leica and its reputation and its celebrity from the Spanish Civil War, say, how is that influencing people like Jones Griffiths and the picture editors of the era working in Life and the Sunday color supplements in the UK? How are they sort of responding to the Nikon and the imagery that it's producing? Yeah, I think and also you'd have to tease apart the history of the cameras and the lenses, and the example of the Korean War of David Douglas Duncan is interesting because he's using a Leica with the Japanese lenses. There's a complex business history there that I don't pretend to have the measure of, around the conversion of the camera industries of Germany and of Japan after the Second World War. As I mentioned, the sort of occupation policies I think would be important to look at. It's a shame that was it Kelly isn't here to join us today, because I bet she would have interesting things to say on that. But thanks, Michael. That's a good question and a rambling answer for you. Sorry.
As I've got the microphone, I'm allowed one more for Jennifer this time. I just wondered if you'd done any work on the availability of sensitized materials, i.e. films and paper, and how that sort of supported the camera manufacturing, and whether you've got any comments on that.
Do you mean the supply of, photo paper, chemicals, et cetera, that photographers could purchase?
Yeah, exactly that, and film as well, and what the local indigenous manufacturing was in the Soviet Union at that point, and how extensive it was to support the supply of cameras.
That's a great question, especially in the period that I talked about here, so the 1930s. There were producers of all the supplies that you would need, but they were in incredibly short supply. And there's a in the satirical magazine Crocodile, there's at least one complaint of someone writing in saying, we have all these great camera models, but I can't use it because I don't have film or I don't have paper. So I mean, it's the classic Soviet economic story where you get one thing in great supply and it's finally accessible to people, and the thing that you need to use it, you can't. I think some of those issues were sorted out later on. I believe KMZ, which is the post-war factory, did start producing those things on its own. But the coordination, I mean, there are documents about people like one factory writing into the dairy industry trying to get gelatin for photo paper and things like that. So there was a lot of bureaucratic loopholes and red tape that people were jumping through trying to get things produced. So yes, that part was definitely a challenge and definitely limited the amount of photos anyone could take.
For Tom, can you speak to how Nikon's hinged back versus Leica's slow to low bottom loading camera influenced Nikon's quick adoption as the photojournalist camera of choice during this period? Interesting question.
That is an interesting question, and I unfortunately don't have an interesting answer. I think it sounds like there are other people in the room and online who would know more about it. As I said, I'd only handled a Nikon F for the first time a couple of weeks ago in doing the research for this. I would imagine that is influential, and I think from what I've read, both of historians of the camera and also from the memoirs and the recollections of photographers, that the automatic winding device, that you could get, this kind of idea of the camera system with all the different lenses and the accessories, I think was key. And that winder, obviously, you could attach and then still change the film. So yeah, I think all of these elements add into the story, and there may also be really pedestrian things that I think Michael was driving at in part with that last question in terms of availability, as Jenny was saying, in a very different time, in a very different place. It matters what's available, and the capacity to have things, flown in and to have them fixed, because a lot of journalists were based out of Japan. I think can't be underestimated.
That's terrific. Thank you. And Jennifer Tucker had written a comment. She says, Tom, there's a big public mural in Salt Lake City of Dennis Hopper behind the camera. The artist is Jan, I'm sorry, Hayworth, who designed the iconic Beatles record cover. So I'm sure you can probably find pictures online. So you may want to check that out if you don't know it already.
Brilliant. I will definitely check that out. Yeah, I will. There's a cultural history of Dennis Hopper as photographer to be explored and to be written, I think. Now that would be fun.
And he was a practicing photographer in real life too, right?
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
He's there too. Any other, so far Zoom's quiet, but any other comments in the room?